My name is Brenda Davis. I'm a registered dietitian. I went vegan in 1989. I was living in Northern Ontario at the time, and it's a bit of a story how I ended up becoming vegan, but it started when I was actually in high school, and so this is the early 70s. And I was just interested in the whole concept of vegetarian and people not eating meat. But after going to university for nutrition, they took that interest away because I learned two things about plant-based diets in university. One was that vegan diets were downright dangerous and vegetarian diets were risky. That was it. People who were interested in vegetarian were made to feel as though it was very fringy, very risky, and very unprofessional to be even thinking about. So what pushed me over the edge after I was in public health nutrition was I was kind of leaning in a plant-based direction, but I had an interaction with a friend who was on his way deer hunting. And he had stopped by for coffee on his way, and we were talking, and I wanted to stop him from killing another deer. So I said to him, I just don't understand why you go in the woods with a big gun and kill such a beautiful, innocent creature who just wants to live. And I said something not very nice. I said, does it somehow make you feel like more of a man killing something? And it was actually what he replied to me that I would say changed the course of my life. He said, Brenda, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger yourself does not mean you are not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy a piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store. He said, at least the animals I eat have had a life. He said, can you say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate? And it was the first time anyone had ever asked me to take responsibility for where my food was coming from. And it really impacted me. I thought to myself, I need to learn more about my food sources. And so I just started researching. It was quite a coincidence because I, first of all, started ordering articles from agricultural journals, and I within probably a week, I thought to myself, I can't stand the system of cruelty that we've created to produce our food. I mean, my mom grew up on a farm, and I always pictured that kind of, beautiful farm image when I pictured animals on farms. And of course, the reality was very far from that. And I thought to myself, why would I choose to contribute to pain, suffering, and death when I don't have to? I mean, I'm a dietitian. I know how to put together a diet that doesn't include animal products that's quite adequate for humans. Approached my husband. We had 2 children at the time, ages 4 and 1. And I said to my husband, I would really like to become a vegetarian. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to do that with me. And his response absolutely shocked me. He looked at me, he smiled, he said, I thought you'd never ask. He said, I'd love to be a vegetarian. He said, when I was in university studying environmental sciences, we learned that the best thing you could do for the environment was to eat lower on the food chain. So he said, I'm in. And that was it. I mean, it was really scary for me because as a dietitian, 35 or whatever years ago, I actually didn't know if there was another living, breathing, registered dietitian on the planet that was a vegetarian, and I was pretty much going vegan. I thought I'd just be ousted from the profession. And I remember going through a thing in my mind, should I stay in the nutrition world? I gave myself a bit of a pep talk, and I said to myself, if I don't stay, when I'm seeing sort of this bigger picture, and everybody who starts to get it just leaves, what will ever change? Change happens from within a little more easily, and I thought, I need to have the courage to stand up for what I'm seeing and what I believe and try to affect change from within my profession. And that was the beginning. And within a year of making that decision, my husband and I moved to Vancouver, where there was actually real live vegetarians. We met for the first time in our lives. So that's the story of how I ended up transitioning to a plant-based diet.
So how do you do something that might be like totally contradicting what the norm is saying to do?
It was about seeing this big picture, seeing what our diet does to animals, what our diet does to the environment, and of course what our diet does to our health as well. And everything I was seeing in terms of health was pointing to the most protective components being concentrated in plant foods as opposed to being concentrated in animal foods. The components of animal foods, the saturated fat and the environmental contaminants that work their way up the food chain, all of that, it just made so much sense to me that we see a global shift towards a more plant-based way of eating. And so I just felt in my bones that it was my obligation as a human being to try to affect change in my profession and for public health. So that was it for me. It was really an ethical belief. I just felt so strongly that I needed to do what I could do to make a difference. One of the things that I felt was absolutely paramount was that I knew my stuff, because I knew I would be challenged by my peers. And so I just read everything I could. So I remember getting a hold of the World Health Organization's 1990 Diet, Nutrition, and the Prevention of Chronic Disease report. It was probably the most earth-shattering thing I had read to that point. It was so powerful politically, and much of what they were saying was exactly what I believed, that the link between diet and disease was so strong, and that the connection between national governments and industries, agricultural industries, was undermining the health of populations, and that things needed to change and people needed to be eating more whole plant foods, really, and fewer animal foods, fewer processed foods. And this was back in 1990, and it was a really powerful document. And that's when Dean Ornish's The Lifestyle Heart Trial came out as well, showing that we could actually reverse coronary artery disease with a plant-based diet. And so things were starting to turn around at that point. And I discovered that there were a few other dietitians who were in the plant-based world, like Ginny Messina and Reed Mangels and George Eisman. And then I discovered Michael Klaper's two books, Vegan Pure and Simple and Vegan Pregnancy. I remember they were like a treasure to me. They were absolutely like a treasure. And I discovered John Robbins' Diet for a New America. He's an absolutely brilliant writer, and his discussions of the animal issues, they moved me so much. They were really powerful. And then I read some of John McDougall's work. So I saw that there was a community that was starting, and I thought, this is something I need to do. And when we moved to Vancouver, I met two dietitians who were vegetarian. One was a Seventh-day Adventist, and one was sort of more like a hippie, I guess, Vasanto, my writing partner, Vasanto Molina. And I was so excited to meet other dietitians who were vegetarian. And very shortly after meeting them, Vasanto, myself, and another dietitian, Victoria Harrison, decided to write a book on vegetarian nutrition, and we called it Becoming Vegetarian. And it was really a vegan book in disguise, because people were not ready for the word vegan yet. But we wrote this vegetarian book, and it's quite a story, because this was 1992 when we started. It came out in 94, and the dairy industry in Canada thought, this book will really be promoting dairy. It's a vegetarian book, and so they got a hold of it. And of course we had it was like I say, a vegan book in disguise. We had a chapter called Without Dairy. and they were mortified, and they actually wrote a 45-page rebuttal to our book, made it free of charge for every health professional, every doctor, every dietitian in the country. They took out a full-page ad in our professional journal to try to discredit our work and to discredit us personally as well. Definitely some pushback, but what was really interesting is that within my profession, I never got the flack I thought I would get. A lot of the dietitians were finding that they were getting clients who were vegetarian and they needed resources to help them. And they were so grateful for the work we were doing to put together resources that could help health professionals help their patients do this right. I ended up becoming the chair of the vegetarian arm of the American Dietetic Association in 2000, which was really quite something to me. And then the other thing that happened was I spoke a few times at the American Dietetic Association, which is now the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, but I also spoke for Dietitians of Canada. And this was a lot of years ago, and I'll never forget, I was being interviewed by somebody in the head office, and unbeknownst to me, one of the people working at her computers listening to the interview, the head of Dietitians of Canada, and she came up to me after and gave me this little box, this little gift. It was a little memento from Dietitians of Canada. And she said, "I just want you to know that you make me so proud to be a dietitian. Thank you for the amazing work you've done." And so, you know, that pushback from my profession that I expected never really happened. And I think it was because Vasanta and myself, when we wrote our book, we just finished our 13th book. The books we've written, we were always very science-based and balanced. And so if there was something about a vegan diet that could be a little iffy, whether it was B12 or vitamin D or iodine or whatever, we laid the cards out on the table. And our goal, you know, my goal as a dietitian was always to make sure that people who wanted to live this way, who wanted to eat this way, would succeed brilliantly, where we wouldn't see B12 deficiency in their children or any other nutritional deficiency, where they would know how to put together a diet that really works. You know, I always feel like vegans have been on trial in the eyes of the world and continue to be. And until we see little vegan babies who grow up into old age and do brilliantly, we will remain on trial in the eyes of the world. And we need to get it right, because a failed vegan is exhibit number one for why people are justified eating meat. And so I think it's really important that if we're doing this, we do it responsibly and we make sure that our needs are being met.
I'm so glad you said all of that.
Okay.
And I want to redefine veganism to include humans in the equations of ethics towards animals, you know? And I think it should. I think we should be trying to be as healthy as we can be. Like you said, to role model this in the proper way. Let's start with children. Is there any reason whatsoever any child on this planet that you're aware of can't be raised vegan? Or should I say, do you feel like all children could benefit from being raised on a whole food plant-based diet?
You know, what's really interesting about children and a variety of diets, what we know is that the advantages of being completely plant-based, no question, reduce risk of chronic disease, and that's a wonderful thing for adults. For children, goal number one is adequate growth and development. And a vegan diet can pose a little bit greater risk in terms of lack of vitamin D, vitamin B12, iodine. So we just need to be careful about ensuring those nutrients are included. And one of the things that I think is really important for people to recognize is that most of our nutritional education materials are geared at omnivores, not at vegans. And so parents have some responsibility. It doesn't matter what kind of diet is fed to children. All diets for children need to be appropriately planned, and there's no difference for a vegan diet. The thing about the vegan diet for children is that children who are vegan tend to eat more fruits and vegetables. They tend to eat more whole grains, more legumes, more nuts and seeds, and fewer processed foods, less sugar, less junk. And so they tend to be leaner, definitely lower risk of obesity. They have a lot of energy. They tend to do very, very well. But on that other side, we just have to make sure we're providing reliable sources of some of the nutrients can fall short in plant foods, specifically vitamin B12. That's number one. And then, of course, vitamin D, depending on the amount of sunshine, iodine, if you're not using salt or iodized salt specifically, or seaweed. We need to be conscious of trace minerals like iron and zinc and so forth. But so do people eating any diet. So we just need to learn about the sources of those nutrients, even calcium. You know, omnivores rely largely on dairy products for calcium. And now we have many non-dairy products or dairy replacements that have about the same amount of calcium in them. And so including some of those things, whether it's soy milk or pea milk or whatever, for children can really help to get those needs met, to get the calcium up there and the vitamin D up there when we're including some of these fortified foods. But certainly, even the position of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics states very clearly that well-planned vegetarian or vegan diets can meet nutrient needs at every stage of the life cycle, whether it's during pregnancy and lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence. There is no reason that a vegan diet can't provide sufficient nutrition. There are some children that have multiple allergies, can't eat legumes, can't eat nuts or seeds. That presents a very different issue. But there are also some people in the world. Like, for instance, I work with a group in with people of the Marshall Islands. And in the Marshall Islands, supplements are not common, and they're living on little islands. And so fish is a very integral part of their culture and their food system. And so it makes sense for them to be using some fish. In some other cultures, where food choices are very limited and food supply is very limited, they may need to use some animal products to provide sufficient calories and sufficient nutrition for their children. But in developed countries where we have access to a wide range of food, fortified foods and all of these things, it's actually relatively simple and very, very safe to provide a really good vegan diet for children. And there were two studies that just came out of Germany, the VECCI studies, the VECCI toddler study, the VECCI youth study, that showed that vegan children compared to lacto-ovo-vegetarian children or omnivorous children grow at about the same rates. They get similar amount of calories. They all did very well. And even looking at protein intakes, that the children, regardless of their dietary category, were meeting their nutrient needs and meeting their nutrient needs for most nutrients. And the vegan children had the highest intakes for many nutrients. So it's, with omnivorous children, it's different nutrients that they would need to be concerned about. So, sometimes vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, folate can be short if they're not including a lot of fruits and vegetables. Whereas for vegan children, it will be B12 and, just other nutrients. Zinc may be an issue. But zinc in the VECCI studies, actually vegans had the highest intake. So it really depends on food choices and how you're putting the diets together.
Now, as far as calcium is concerned, do we really need to depend on fortified drink?
Really and truly, it's a little tricky for children to get enough just by eating greens because the quantities they consume are often fairly limited. It's not impossible if you have tofu that's made with calcium, if you include some of the, the chia seeds and the almonds and the figs and lots of beans, but generally the amount they eat, if you're trying to meet the RDA especially, which is like 1,000 milligrams for 4 to 8-year-olds, it can be really challenging. You throw in 1 or 2 cups of fortified milk and you'll easily get them to that target. For adults, because we eat a bigger volume of food, we can eat easily large volumes of low oxalate greens. It's a little easier, but even for adults, if you had 1 cup of fortified non-dairy milk, it would definitely get you to where you want to go. And especially as a senior, for women over 50, men over 70, the RDA is 1,200 milligrams. to reach that target is more challenging. And it is debatable whether or not we really need that much, because there are many countries in the world that have lower RDAs for calcium and seem to amble along reasonably well. And plant-based eaters, we consume, it's a less acidic diet. We consume less sodium. We consume less of the things that tend to compromise calcium absorption, I would say. And so we may need a little bit less. I don't think it's a bad idea to aim for the RDA, and at least in that realm. I have to say, of all the studies of Epic Oxford and the studies looking at health outcomes of people eating vegan diets, we do so well where heart disease is concerned, where cancer is concerned, where diabetes is concerned, where gout is concerned, all of these different diverticular disease, you name it. The one place we don't do as well is bone density and osteoporosis risk. One of the reasons is because we're leaner and we have less bone mass because we're leaner. And so we're at a little bit higher risk. And then we had that Polish study of the children from Poland who were 5 to 10 years old, vegan children, really did have lower bone mass. And so we want to be somewhat conscious because we want to get this right. So we want to be conscious about making sure that we get enough calcium, vitamin D, all of the nutrients that are important for bone health, enough protein, all of those nutrients to build and maintain strong bones and to reach a reasonable peak bone mass during childhood. And so it's not just a matter of, just eat any old thing, a variety of plant foods and you'll be all good. Just not that simple, because plant foods aren't good sources of B12. They can be reasonable sources of calcium, but you need to be aware of the foods that are rich sources of calcium. If you think, leafy greens are a great source, but your main leafy green is spinach, you get about 5% of the calcium from spinach, as opposed to 40 to 70% for other, the low oxalate greens like kale and a lot of the Chinese greens and turnip greens and so forth. I mean, Swiss chard, beet greens, and spinach are very rich in calcium, but they're very poor sources of calcium because we can't absorb much of the calcium that they provide.
Now, because of the oxalates?
Because of the oxalates.
Aren't those pretty much destroyed by maybe heating or getting baby leaves and things like that?
The oxalates can be reduced in cooking, but they're definitely not eliminated. So I would still be, not rely on those greens as calcium sources.
And I wonder, in these studies, did they control for the amount of greens these people are even eating and like sunshine? Because, vitamin D, of course, helps with that, right?
And vitamin D helps hugely with calcium absorption, and so does eating small amounts of calcium throughout the day rather than one large bolus. Like if you drink, a cup and a half of milk or plant-based fortified milk, you'll absorb much less of the calcium if you're drinking it all at once than if you have little bits of calcium throughout the day, because the rate of absorption decreases as the amount increases. And so there are all kinds of little tricks, but generally we just want to be conscious of including the low oxalate greens and eating them in a reasonable volume.
I've heard the same thing about iron too.
Yeah, so iron, the absorption of iron can be greatly compromised by phytates and by polyphenolic compounds like the tannins in tea, for example. But the biggest source of phytates for a lot of people is wheat bran, especially in the 80s where people sprinkled bran on everything, and because it's such a high source of fiber, but it's also such a high source of phytates that it can reduce iron absorption from about 50 to 90% in a meal. So we don't want to be sprinkling foods with bran, and we just want to be conscious if you're a big tea drinker, for example, and you drink the high tannin teas like black tea or green tea or white tea, really want to be keeping that separate from your meals if you have any issues with your iron status. So, at least an hour, before or after that you would be drinking the tea, or look for teas that are, herbal teas that aren't high in tannins.
Can't you profoundly increase absorption just adding a little lemon juice and whatnot and drinking maybe a little orange juice or something with that iron-rich food?
Oh, absolutely. So the greatest enhancers of iron absorption are vitamin C and organic acids. There are some, things that have a lot less research to sort of back them, but things like garlic and onions and ginger and black pepper, there are other things that can also enhance iron absorption, but the main one really is vitamin C and organic acids in fruits and vegetables.
But what really prompted this segment of the conversation was, I think I've heard before that you can increase iron absorption, try not to get it all at once.
That's true, yes, absolutely. So generally when you're having small bits throughout the day, I think it's one of the advantages of a vegan diet, to be honest, because almost everything you eat has little bits of calcium, little bits of iron. In fact, vegans actually consume more iron than any other dietary group, which shocks people because they think, well, meat's the main source of iron. But almost everything you eat as a vegan provides iron. So what we see is omnivores eating maybe 16 or 17, 18 milligrams a day, and vegans eating 20, 21, 22. It's not a huge difference, but we fairly consistently see higher intakes among vegans, and vegans generally don't have a higher rate of iron deficiency, but we do see a little bit higher rate in menstruating women for whatever reason. Well, of course, in plant foods, it's non-heme iron, which aren't absorbed as efficiently as heme iron, but that may end up working to our advantage because diets high in heme iron do tend to be associated with more, heart disease, more diabetes, and so forth. Heme iron can serve as a pro-oxidant, non-heme iron can't. So that's important too.
Now, could it be that the RDAs, I think, and you've already said this, aren't necessarily designed for vegans, and vegans may have such a different physiological disposition that maybe they not only need less of certain nutrients, but maybe they also have different things going on, different metabolic pathways and different enzymes or whatever, if they're raised vegan, if they're raised on a whole food plant-based diet. Could it be that they're maybe more protective from these deficiencies that other vegans are? And
to be honest, we don't really know for sure, but what we do know is, in particular with calcium, is that the calcium requirements vary dramatically with multiple factors. So sun exposure, how much weight-bearing exercise you're doing, how much sitting you're doing, if you smoke cigarettes, there are just so many factors, how much vitamin K you eat, how much protein you eat, how much vitamin C you consume, how much, there are so many nutrients that contribute to bone health, and so there are multiple factors. A person in Africa who has a larger bone structure, who's carrying water on their head and carrying babies on their back or whatever it is, who's outside all day in the sunshine, their requirements may be a lot less than someone who's in North America, who's sitting at a desk smoking a cigarette and very sedentary and eating a lot of salt and meat. They would have much higher calcium requirements. And so it's hard to say, if you're vegan, you need X amount. It depends on, are you active? Are you outdoors? Are you in the sunshine? How dark is your skin? There are just many, many factors that affect calcium absorption. And so generally, I think we could feel fairly safe to say that vegans probably require a little bit less calcium than someone who's consuming a very highly processed, high sodium, meat-based diet. How much less, we don't know. What we do know is vegans tend to have lower bone density from many studies. And so it's a little bit of a crapshoot. And my, as a dietitian, I would say, let's err on the side of caution. We don't want our children to end up with a reduced peak bone mass because we're ignoring calcium and other nutrients that are important for bone density. So I would say, even though we may not need quite the RDA, I don't think it's a bad idea to shoot for the RDA anyway.
I would really like to know if vegans from birth have a lower bone density?
To be honest, I don't know if the children in the Polish study who had a lower bone density, the 5 to 10-year-olds, if they were vegan from birth, but I'm guessing they were. And same with the children in the Vecchi studies. I'm guessing they were probably vegan from birth because it was, toddlers, and then a study on 6 to 18-year-olds. And so I would assume quite a few of those children were raised vegan. And so,
did they control for their BMI?
Now that's a good question. I think so. In the Polish study they did, and that was the concern. They had controlled for BMI, they controlled for a number of things, and still the vegan children had lower bone density. And they definitely had lower calcium intake as well. And in the Vecchi studies, the vegan children, they all had calcium intakes below the RDA in that country, but the vegans had the lowest calcium and vitamin D intakes. To me, it's not a big deal. Like, if you think about the way that national governments have handled nutrition shortfalls throughout, many decades. We've added iodine to salt. We've added vitamin D and vitamin A to milk. We've added iron and B vitamins to flour, and folate to flour, or folic acid to flour, and we've added to try to make up for the shortfalls. Well, with vegans, a lot of those nutrients aren't as big of an issue. Folate we get easily on a plant-based diet. A lot of the B vitamins are fairly easily provided and so forth. But we need to be concerned about some other nutrients. And so, there are different ways we can approach it. Just get really familiar with the foods that are rich in those nutrients. And our national nutrition guides are so, especially in the States. Now Canada's has changed significantly, but in the States, it's still dairy that's the primary source of calcium, or considered the primary source of calcium for the population. So most of the nutrition education materials teach people, consume 2 or 3 servings of dairy a day, instead of being designed for plant-based eaters and saying eat so many servings of greens and so many servings of almonds and tahini and chia seeds. And so we need to just get familiar with those sources in plant-based diets so that we can make sure that we have those bases covered.
We've talked a lot about kind of the shortcomings, as you put it. Are there any other shortcomings?
There are some things that are still a little bit controversial, like the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And iodine can really be an issue in countries where the soil is very poor in iodine. Some, vegans do sort of the SOS and aren't using salt and may not be big on seaweed. In Japan, they use a lot of seaweed, so iodine's not much of an issue. But in North America, we don't tend to do that. And so you have to figure out, okay, where's the iodine coming from? Because iodine shortfalls can cause IQ shortfalls in children. So if you're, even a mild deficiency of iodine can rob a child of 10 to 15 IQ points. Iodine deficiency is the biggest cause of cognitive impairment for children worldwide. So we need to be aware of that. Where do people get their iodine in omnivorous diets? Well, milk, fish. There are these sources that we're cutting out on a vegan diet, so we need to make sure we're including a reliable source, which easily could be seaweed. Even a 1/16 of a teaspoon of kelp powder provides enough for an adult for the day. The children's needs aren't much less than adult needs. An adult needs 150 micrograms a day. Children need somewhere between 90 and 120. Infants need even more. It's 110 to 130. So it seems like a lot for a tiny little body, but iodine is really important to brain function, and that's why. So we need to be aware of that. Long-chain fatty acids, it may be, if you're born and raised vegan, that your ability to convert alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA is fairly efficient. And it may remain efficient for your life, but we don't have a lot of studies looking at that. And so the thinking at this point is that it may not be a bad idea to provide, the original source of EPA and DHA is little plants in the ocean, And so we can grow those plants that are EPA, DHA-rich microalgae and consume them rather than consuming the fish, sort of skip the fish and just go right to the source. So that's an option too. So there are things. Generally, you're looking at any downsides. For a lot of people, the biggest downside is social. I think one of the most important things for a human being is to belong, and to belong within their tribe, and to feel accepted and loved and respected. And sometimes when you're doing something very different from the tribe, it can be threatening to the tribe, and they can feel judged or feel like you're letting them down somehow because you can't share the same food anymore. And food is one of our most important things that connect us socially. And so I think for a lot of people that can be the biggest challenge. And fortunately, it's starting to change. We're seeing more and more vegan options in restaurants and more vegan food choices in the supermarkets and so forth. But it's still an issue for a lot of families. So that part can be challenging too. And the way that I tend to approach it myself is with a lot of love and compassion, because I did eat meat at one time as well. It can be hard for your loved ones. And so, whenever I'm eating with my family that's not vegan, we just try to accommodate everyone. And if we're eating at my house, of course it's going to be vegan. But if I'm eating at their house, they always make sure that there's something vegan for me, or I bring something to share, and we still enjoy meals together. And I know not everyone's comfortable doing that. They're not comfortable if there's meat on a table. I've tended to be a bit more flexible that way, just because I love my family and I value the connection with them, and I feel like my ability to impact them is greater when I stay connected to them and I model healthy behavior. I feel like, well, maybe my family that's not doing this, when they have some health crisis, they might think, well, look at Brenda. She's been doing this for so many years. She still can do everything physically and it doesn't take any medicine, and I'm on 5 medicines. Maybe she's doing something that I could learn from. And so I feel like it's so important to keep those channels of communication open and our connection strong. I feel like I have a better chance of having an impact that way.
I think it might be helpful for people to understand that iodine, for example, the reason why it's in milk is because, isn't it like a part of the processing of milk, like the cleaning?
Iodine is used to clean the cow's teeth. It's a disinfectant, essentially, and that's why it's in milk. It's not something miraculous about milk that it's high in iodine. It's used in the processing, exactly.
Yeah, so if we're having to compensate, it's not because of some inferior aspect of
veganism. It is absolutely not.
Yeah.
And when there are shortfalls in an omnivorous diet, we just figure out how to get around it. We've done that for decades, and we can do the same with a vegan diet. There's so many advantages eating vegan in terms of decreased risk of overweight and obesity, and decreased risk of chronic disease, and with longevity and health and all of those things. So many advantages, and not just that, advantages for the animals, for the environment. It just makes so much sense as a global population that we move in that direction. So much so that most of the major authorities now, whether it's the Eat Lancet Commission or the FAO, WHO, are suggesting a shift, a global shift towards a plant-based diet. That is hugely important for us to recognize.
Yeah, and then the same goes for B12. I mean, the only reason why we get it in the things that we consume is through cross-contamination, right? It's nothing inherent in the meat or eggs or dairy, maybe as much, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's in, animal muscle tissue, it's in the bloodstream of animals and so forth. But what a lot of people don't realize is that way back when, in Paleolithic times, etc., people would get it when they, would drink dirty water or eat dirty plants. B12 is produced by microorganisms, these tiny little bacteria that, that produce B12, and it can be on few fermented tempeh in a really dirty container. It will have some B12. We've sanitized our food supply so much that we've removed those kinds of sources to avoid consuming pathogenic bacteria. And so, we need to add it. And in fact, a lot of animals, many of the B12 supplements that are in the food supply are fed to animals because they're short too. And so it's not anything miraculous about animal products, but we do need to be aware that plant foods are not really reliable sources, and so we need to take care of it, because if we don't get enough B12, if we're a pregnant woman and our baby's born with a B12 deficiency, they can develop irreversible brain damage within a matter of months. And so it's just something we need to be aware of, and we need to make sure we have it in the form of a supplement or a fortified food or whatever.
These aren't really shortcomings due to this vegan diet. It's just our unnatural lifestyle. And even with the calcium, it could be just mostly the bone density thing, because we're living in such an unnatural environment.
Absolutely.
Now, did they control for sunshine or D?
And that I'm not sure. I'd have to go back to the study and look at that.
Yeah.
But they do look at vitamin D in many of the studies where there's a little bit lower bone density. But in Epic Oxford, there were several potential reasons for lower bone density among the vegans, and I think probably one of the biggest was just that we're leaner, we're lighter, and that can make a big difference.
And maybe not even necessarily a problem.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I believe it was only people with a BMI under 22 or something that had the lower bone density. If you had a little bit higher BMI, there was no difference. And then of course, vitamin B12, vitamin D, there were all sorts of nutrients that could have possibly contributed as well.
How protective could it be to raise a child on a whole food plant-based diet? Like, in what ways is it protective?
Yes, so it is protective in a number of ways, because basically, when you're raising a child on a vegan diet, the diet is going to be richer in all of the components that reduce inflammation, that reduce oxidative stress, that reduce, overeating, really, and that promote a healthy gut microbiome, which is important to every aspect of health, to brain health, to gut health, to every aspect of health. It reduces the storage of fat where fat shouldn't be stored. It reduces glycotoxicity. It just reduces all of those things. And it instills in a child a love for fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and all of these healthy foods, which protects them in the long term against the diseases that kill most of us. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, intestinal diseases, all of these things will be reduced over their lifespan, which is quite a gift as far as I'm concerned. And when you think about in North America, the rates of overweight and obesity, having that significantly reduced is another very, very important attribute of a plant-based diet.
The things that you're mentioning, aren't these essentially the leading causes of issues and death and premature death?
Oh, absolutely. 70% of people die of chronic diseases that are lifestyle induced, at least. I mean, that might be an underestimate, and probably is an underestimate in North America, but at least 70%. And so when you think about that, it's a no-brainer. I mean, eating plant-based is just makes so much sense, and it makes so much sense not just for ourselves, but beyond ourselves, because of the ecological and the ethical consequences of eating animal foods versus eating plant foods. The carbon footprint of plant foods is a fraction of what it is for animal products. The ethical ramifications, when you think about the 80 billion land animals every year, that doesn't include anything from the ocean. that we're slaughtering, and 90% of them are raised in CAFOs. It's just an absolute nightmare. And it's a nightmare that is, to me, completely, totally unjustifiable. There is no reason for it. We are hurting ourselves, we're hurting the planet, and we're hurting the animals, and it's unnecessary. We're at a point now where if you really, really want to eat meat, or you love the taste of meat so much, we can grow it in a lab. We can, we've got, as human beings, it to me seems so irresponsible to be raising these billions of animals that in that fashion, when we've got to have the intelligence to figure out a way to provide ourselves with food that won't destroy the planet in the process, and won't be so ridiculously cruel to all of these innocent creatures that don't deserve that kind of treatment. People say they love animals, and they treat their dogs and cats with so much regard, and then you turn around and eat a pig that is more intelligent than the average dog. I don't know if you remember that study in Berkeley, but it was absolutely mind-blowing, because they were training pigs to play a game where if they matched two things on the computer screen and used their snout to pull a lever, when they got the match correct, they would get a treat. And the researcher says there was no pig that ever made a mistake. And they said they tried to teach chimpanzees the same game, and they would often say to the chimpanzees, if you were a pig, you would have this by now. Pigs are really, really intelligent creatures, and what we do to them is just, to me, beyond belief. You'll have 100,000 pigs in one building, tail to snout, where they have no room to lay down, they have way more sensitive smellers than humans, and we have to put a gas mask on to go in, and we expect them to breathe the stench, and it's just, and these animals that would live, 12 to 15 years, about the same as a dog, live 6 months before they're slaughtered for food. It's just disgusting. And we somehow justify it because they're food. They're super intelligent creatures, and even intelligence maybe shouldn't be a way of judging the worth of an animal, or why one animal should be abused and another not. They're living creatures who deserve to be treated with some respect. And so I just feel so strongly about that sort of ethical piece, that we've got to start taking responsibility for the way that we are raising food, however we're growing or raising food. And it just is so unnecessary.
Yeah, and they're in these concentrated animal feeding operations because it's so unsustainable. And what's even more mind-blowing is if you look at like the FAO's land usage chart and food intake, global food intake, they're using up like 77% of the land, but they're only producing about 20% of global food intake.
Yeah, exactly.
The rest is plant, but a lot of that's processed, and only about 17% is whole food. It sounds like the benefits greatly outweigh any kind of potential fear anybody should have about raising their children plant-based. If somebody's controlling for these simple things like iodine and B12 and vitamin D, and then cognizant of calcium intake, raising their children, do you feel like it could be the most protective diet of all?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. A plant-exclusive diet is without a doubt the most protective diet of all. We have lots of evidence showing that. And so I think it's just a wonderful gift to children. Just take care of the few little things that are an issue, and then make sure that you're providing high quality food, sufficient food, enough calories. Don't get overly restrictive where you're trying to do 2 meals a day or even 3. Children need snacks. Provide them sufficient food and sufficient variety. Don't be afraid of something like tofu or tempeh, or provide them variety, and it'll take care of itself. I don't think a multivitamin mineral supplement is a bad idea. A little bit of extra zinc, selenium, whatever, can help to top children off, especially if they're fussy eaters. And then you can sneak in the iodine's there, a little extra vitamin D is there, and the B12 can be there as well. So it's an option. But generally, there's no question, this is the most protective way of eating of all.
Yeah. So when you say that, the obvious conclusion that somebody's going to come to may be something that would be really hard for them to say. And that is, by not raising your child on a whole food plant-based diet, you're hurting them.
I would be a little bit hesitant to say that, although in reality, you probably are, because you're hurting the planet. You're hurting the animals. We're all connected. And so you're hurting your children, your grandchildren, and so forth in the long run. If we're just looking at health and not looking at all of the other consequences of our food choices, we do see populations in the world that have extraordinarily good health, who do consume some animal product. Maybe it's a little bit of fish or a little bit of, whatever it is that's part of their culture. And it can work really well for them, and the children can be very, very, very healthy. So I hesitate to say, well, for health, you have to be absolutely vegan, because we know that that's not necessarily true. There are populations around the world that do really quite well, including small amounts of animal products. But generally, if you look from the bigger picture and you're thinking of the ethical discussions and the ecological impact of what we eat, then it's just a no-brainer. This world needs to move in a plant-based direction, because if we don't, we may not have a planet for future generations. And I think we're really close to being at a point where there's no turning back. We have very fragile life support systems, and we are undermining them by the way that we are producing food for a very large and growing population. And we as a human species have a responsibility to do what we can do to stop the destruction. We need to get it. We really need to get it, and we need to get it quick. And I think that the world will become plant-based at some point, because we have to. There will be no option. Let's just move in that direction sooner than later.
Do you think we'll see a vegan world?
I sure think so, because like I say, I don't see an option. I really don't.
Now, in those places where, like in the blue zones, where they're eating a very moderate amount of fish, if it's not practical for them to be vegan, I mean, you can't expect them to be vegan.
No, exactly.
But what I think the audience, though, the viewers, are overwhelmingly, predominantly in places where they have access to
Yes.
alternatives.
Yeah.
If they have these alternatives, like that are exclusive variety of plants, and maybe, like this B12 supplement for our lifestyle and the D, they could do just as well as, or even better than these populations. Talk on the blue zones a little bit, because a lot of people get confused about that, and they say, oh, well, they eat animals, and Okinawa eats pork, and they're eating fish over here, or whatever.
So for people that aren't really familiar with the blue zones, these are 5 populations in the world that have more centenarians than anywhere else in the world. They tend to live very long, healthy lives. When they're in their 80s and 90s, they're still pretty productive. They're walking in the mountains. They're doing, working in their gardens, and it's really very interesting. The 5 blue zones are Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Loma Linda, California, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, Icaria, Greece. And so you've got these populations that do very, very well. Now, the question about could vegetarians or vegans, plant-exclusive eaters, do even better? I have no doubt they could do even better. And the blue zones, it's not just about diet. They all eat plant-predominant diets. They all eat legumes as dietary staples. But it's not just about diet. It's about, having strong families and being very socially connected and not smoking a lot and always being, moderately physically active in their daily activities. They walk a lot. They're they're gardening, they're always out being active. And so there are many factors that combine to give people a greater longevity. But I believe for people who are eating exclusively plant-based, who are doing all of those things as well, that we could do even better. I have no doubt we could do even better, especially if we're eating a very nutrient-dense, carefully chosen diet. We could see people living, to 100 and beyond in reasonable health. I really do believe that. And it's interesting, when you go to Loma Linda, these is sort of the most vegetarian of the blue zones. Loma Linda, California is a community rich with, and that particular blue zone is Seventh-day Adventists, not all of whom are vegan, some of whom are lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and even some, omnivores there, but there are people that tend to be, very much more towards the vegetarian spectrum than maybe some of the other blue zones. But when you're in Loma Linda and you take a look around, what is so inspiring to me is the way that the 80 and 90 and plus year olds move. They are walking briskly. They are doing a lot. I remember one of the last times I was in Loma Linda, I saw one of the researchers there and waved to him, and he came over, and I think he was 92 or 93 years old. He walked over briskly as can be and started talking to me and said, so what do you think of all this? It was at the time where some of the new sodium research was coming out, and we started talking about the research, and I asked him what he was up to, and he was still speaking all over the world.
Nice.
and in his early 90s, and I just thought, this is so inspiring. I just and his brain was just on fire. He was working, had his finger on the pulse of all the new research, and it was really, really neat to see. And so I just believe it's absolutely possible.
Yeah. Now some people say, oh, I know somebody who did this, that, or the other, ate meat, drank, smoked, whatever, and they lived to be 100 or whatever.
Of course.
Yeah.
There are always those stories, but what you have to do is look at the research, and when you look at the research, those people have a far greater chance of dying early than people that are living a healthy lifestyle. It's not a question. There will always be exceptions. There will be vegans who get cancer when they're 35 or 40. And you go like, what the heck? I was doing everything right. There are many factors that contribute to cancer, and they could have been exposed to whatever they were exposed to. And people who are, smokers and drinkers and meat eaters till they're 100, they had a very good constitution and a lot of luck and a lot of lives. Those things always happen, but you can't base your decisions on the exception. It's better to base your decisions on the rule and what we see in terms of large numbers of people.
I get a lot of comments on my videos, and people pop up and, oh, well, there's these phytotoxins. You mentioned some already. Oxalates, phytates, lectins, tannins. There's all these sopanins, whatever.
Yeah.
There's so many things. But I've heard, some of these things are actually protective even.
Some people call them anti-nutrients in foods, and these are essentially things in foods that protect plants. They protect, plants from a premature release of the stored forms of nutrients in the plants. They protect plants from predators. They're there for a lot of good reasons. And they can compromise the absorption of some nutrients, but they often are highly protective in small doses. They protect plants, they also protect people. And even things like phytates can be quite protective. They can be protective against cancer and so forth. So while we don't want to necessarily overdo them, it's not a bad idea to get some in the diet. Some of the compounds like phytates and some of the other compounds, many of the ways that we deal with foods decrease those things. So if you sprout, if you cook, if you ferment, if you yeast or leaven a bread, you reduce those anti-nutrients. Sprouting tremendously reduces them. So there are lots of ways that we can moderate our intakes of these so-called anti-nutrients. I'm not sure it's a very good label for them, because in some ways they can actually be very protective.
This lends itself well to, talking about variety. So the kind of variety that we should get, I've heard recently somebody suggest, getting 30 different types of plant foods in a week. I don't know where they heard that from, maybe Goldhammer or somebody.
Yeah.
Let's talk about food real quick, like beans, greens, grains, fruits, veggies, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, spices. That's what I usually give people a rundown.
Yes, perfect.
You got G-bombs or whatever. Like, what is your deal? How do you say it?
I think I say it a lot like you.
Okay.
Because, I often think in terms of food groups. And so, you want your diet to be based on leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, beans, lentils, sort of that legume kingdom, nuts and seeds, and then some starches as well to give you satiety, to give you energy. And that could be in the form of starchy vegetables or intact. I prefer intact grains or lightly processed grains. So it could be cut grains or rolled grains or something like that. But generally, and then the herbs and spices, I love you said that, because they add not only flavor to our foods, but they add a lot of antioxidants and phytochemicals, and per unit, per gram, they're more concentrated in some of those compounds than anything else. So those are the real keys to a healthy plant-based diet. We want to have variety, we want to have color, and we want to have a reasonable mix of all of those foods with a focus on the non-starchy vegetables, I think, and the green leafy vegetables.
And I like to usually also say a variety within each category.
Yes, within each category, absolutely.
Yeah. And is that hard to do? So give us an idea of what you like to eat on a given
day. Okay, that's a kind of a fun question. So I'm a little bit of a creature of habit, but I try to vary things up. So my breakfast is almost always the same. So my breakfast is, I call it a breakfast bowl, and I start with sprouted grains, like maybe sprouted kamut, sometimes some cooked grains like cooked oat groats, for example. And I often, if I cook grains, I'll cook a little bit of lentils in with the grains to balance that grain and legume. And so that'll be, sort of the base of the bowl. And then I add in probably 2 cups of cut up fruits and berries. So I'll have, my favorite season is summer, where there's a lot of berries available, peaches, apricots, all of that. In the wintertime, it'll more be apples and bananas and whatever fruit, mangoes, whatever fruit I can get a hold of. And then I like something creamy in my breakfast. So it could be a non-dairy yogurt, but generally it's a chia pudding. I'll make a chia pudding, I'll add a little bit of chia, always have a chia pudding in the fridge, so I'll add a little bit of that. And then I have a dehydrated granola, homemade granola. I'll put a little bit of that for some crunch, a little bit of cinnamon, ginger, whatever seasonings on top, and then some sort of non-dairy milk. And that's my basic breakfast bowl. I love, if I have the opportunity, if I have time, to have a green juice before the cereal, or even a little bit of steamed greens with a touch of balsamic vinegar, something like that to get the greens in. And then lunch is always a giant salad. So that's almost always, very rarely that I don't have that. And it's a really big salad with leafy and wild greens, sprouts, usually broccoli sprouts, sunflower sprouts, whatever sprouts I'm growing. And if I'm not growing, then whatever, I can purchase from my organic delivery service. And then I try to get to cover the rainbow. So, I'll have some green vegetables in with the leafy greens, some red, some orange, some yellow, some purple, blue. I try to get all of those colors mixed in. And then I always have a starch. So that might be a little bit of kamut berries or some sort of a butternut squash cubes or something like that. And I always have a protein. So it might be some sort of beans or chickpeas or hummus or even lentils or cubes of tofu or something like that. And then I always put seeds on top, so it could be pumpkin seeds or whatever seeds. And then I top it with a dressing, and my dressing is usually tahini hemp seed. So tahini hemp seed, lemon juice, maybe some vinegars, and then some fresh ginger and garlic and whatever. I'll play around with that. And that's my typical lunch, and I love it. And I always have a fresh orange or fresh fruit for dessert. And then my dinner it varies, of course. Sometimes it'll be, a variety of salads. Sometimes it'll be, a stew or some sort of grain and veggies. One of my favorites is my son taught me how to do these lentil pancakes. It's just lentils and water, and you blend it in the blender, and it makes these beautiful pancakes. And then I stuff it with often asparagus and wild mushrooms and a cashew cream sauce with whatever veggies are on hand, and then do these kind of little crepe things, and I love doing bowls. I love these. Some people call them Buddha bowls or glory bowls or whatever, where you have a green or starchy vegetable on the bottom, and then all kinds of steamed vegetables, and then beans or tofu, and then some sort of wonderful peanut sauce or something like that. And so those are my favorite things. And then dessert is almost always fruit-based, so it might be a fruit, frozen banana ice cream or something, or just apples with some nut butter to dip and some cinnamon on top. And yeah, those are my favorite things. And for treats, if I want a real treat, I do make some kind of sinful treats that are, I use dates and a nut butter to make caramel. And then I make these little turtle kind of things with pecans and the caramel, and then I brush very dark chocolate on top and freeze them. And so those will be for special treats. Or I make cookies that I don't use any sugar. I just use a little bit of dried fruit and sometimes grated carrots and all kinds of spices, and no flour. I don't use flour in them, just maybe some rolled oats or something like that. And nut butter for the fat, and they're wonderful. So I do have treats on occasion and enjoy them, but that's basically my diet.
Grind up pumpkin seed, and it's super high in iron too.
Oh yeah, pumpkin seeds are awesome, and they're high in zinc as well. And my son, he's an incredible cook, but he makes scrambled eggs out of pumpkin seeds.
Wow.
And I said, but how? And he said, it is a bit of a pain because you have to soak them and remove the skins. But he said they're amazing, amazing. And so he's always had some real skills with coming up with interesting, fun things, or he gets them from people on the internet or whatever, but he'll be creating new things. He makes all kinds of veggie roasts and you name it. So it's always fun to hear what he's doing.
And it's always good to throw like Brazil nut in there, right? For selenium or whatever, because you mentioned selenium earlier.
And I do. I actually have a seed mix that I forgot to mention, goes on my breakfast bowl, which has hemp seeds, ground flax seeds, chia seeds, and chopped up Brazil nuts.
Nice.
So I cover all the bases there.
Yeah. And then I guess you don't want to overdo the Brazil nuts, of course, right?
No, they're very high in selenium.
Yeah. But then also like sesame seeds are great for calcium, right?
Yes. Yeah, they have a fair bit of calcium, but chia seeds are even higher.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, chia seeds are a really good calcium source.
Speaking of seeds, flax seeds, of course, are high in the alpha-linolenic acid, right? They're also high in cyanide, right?
Yes, so they do contain what we call cyanogenic glycosides. And so the cyanogenic glycosides are broken down by cooking. Mm-hmm. So if you're eating raw flax, you probably want, you don't want to be eating like a cup a day. A couple of tablespoons, 2-3 tablespoons is probably not an issue. But if you're getting much more than that, the cyanogenic glycosides could be a bit of an issue. So we just need to be aware of that. And they are goitrogens as well. So.
Oh, yeah. So what I like to do, since I learned that, I have groats in the morning also. And the last 2 minutes of them simmering, I'll throw in the flax seeds.
Yeah. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and then I kind of increase the heat a little bit right there and let them.
Yeah.
And
Good
then, but
idea.
then it makes the groats. It makes them like super like thick. You
Yeah,
know, and like
for
almost
sure.
like a pudding.
Gluey, yeah.
Weird. Yeah. But I just started doing that. Do you have like a favorite quote or any kind of quotes you like to share?
You know, one of my very favorite quotes is the quote that Dr. Sabatino gave today, the quote from Albert Einstein, the one about widening our circles of compassion to include the beauty of all nature, that we need to, as human beings, widen our circles of compassion to include all creatures, all living creatures, and all the beauty of nature. And then I love Albert Schweitzer and all of his quotes and how he talked about true ethics and true what it is to be a truly ethical human being, where you wouldn't harm anything, and until we get to that point, we're not really understanding ethics. And I wish I had those quotes in front of me, but I love both of, they have so many wonderful quotes. Of course, I love that quote by Chief Seattle as well, that all things are connected, like the blood which unites one family. Whatever it's about the web of life, and whatever you do to the web, we do to ourselves. I love that quote, and there's controversy about where it really comes from, whether it really is Chief Seattle or someone else, but I love the concept of that we need to recognize how intimately connected all living things are, and what we do to one part of the web of life, we do to ourselves. One of the things that I think is so valuable for people to recognize is that there's really no doctor or dietitian that can make a lifestyle change for you. I think this is important because I think it's empowering. It's empowering to know that you're really the captain of your ship. You're the one that decides what goes into your mouth. You're the one that decides how you're going to move your body. It's under your control. And what I really love about that is that the human body wants to be healthy. There's this strong drive for our bodies to be healthy. And what you put in your mouth is really the raw materials with which you will build your brain, with you will rebuild every part of your body. And when you suddenly start to dramatically shift what you're putting in your mouth, you change everything. And one of the things that has really surprised me in my research, the work I've done with lifestyle medicine, is how rapidly this happens. It's extraordinary. So when you change, within a week, you start to see a dramatic shift in how you look, how you feel, your blood levels of cholesterol and triglycerides and everything. It just all starts to shift, and it's all within your power, it's within your control. And so you may have type 2 diabetes, you may have heart disease. You have the power to change that. These are largely reversible diseases, and not in every case can you reverse type 2 diabetes or heart disease, but you can make a huge dent in the right direction. And for many people, you can definitely put yourself into remission, which is a really powerful concept. I just want to encourage people that regardless of where you're at right now, think about where you want to go, because where you want to go is where you can go. And just know that the help is out there, the support is out there. There are many people that have done this who would love to be your cheerleader. And this is a growing community, and I feel like one of the things that I think is so important for those of us who are vegan, who are plant-based, is to really be as non-judgmental and accepting. This isn't an exclusive club. We welcome people wherever you're at on your journey, and we would love to be able to help you to get where you really want to go.
Really hard for people to navigate this information in the world today. There's so much information coming from all these different places, and you got the carnivore, the keto, the paleo, and you've done a lot of good research on that. I've seen some of your videos. How do you feel about it today? The carnivore, the keto, the paleo, the Atkins, all these different iterations. As far as the evidence is concerned, sure, there's a lot of anecdotal and short-term research, right? From all your research, what's your elevator pitch against that?
Yeah, so my elevator pitch against keto, paleo, all of these sort of high fat or very high protein diets that are very much animal, sort of centered diets is really very simple. If the whole world went in that direction, we would be in very big trouble in very short order. And we can't just make decisions that are just all about me, me, me. We have to think about the consequences of our choices beyond ourselves. And David Katz, a very well respected researcher from Yale University, did the math on this. He said if everybody ate a paleo diet right now, we would need about 15 planet Earths to sustain the current population. Imagine if we were all doing keto and paleo, and it's just frightening. As it is, we're in a crisis. We're so concerned about climate change and our carbon footprint and all of those things. We would be in such deep trouble if we did that. I know these diets are risky long term. We have tons of research that has shown that these animal-centered diets reduce longevity, they increase mortality. They're just not good news long term, but they're even worse news for the planet and for the animals. Imagine if we all ate paleo, we would probably triple or quadruple our meat intake. That's an absolute nightmare to even conceive of. And so I just think it's so irresponsible to promote a diet that is that destructive to the planet. And that's the bottom line for me.
What is the most compelling evidence that you found you feel like maybe destroys all of that?
Well, I guess I would say, the studies that have looked at mortality and animal protein intake, and even the 2018 Seidelman study that looked at intakes of carbohydrates. And if you look at where you see the degree of increase in risk of death, the lower your carbohydrate intake, it's really quite startling. And then all of the studies, from Harvard and from Japan that have looked at meat intake and risk of death, risk of heart disease, risk of cancer, and so forth, we know consistently from these studies that the higher your intake of animal protein, the greater your risk of death and disease. We had a study, Levine, in 2014, looking at the people consuming more than 20% of calories from protein, and what it showed, and of course paleo is about 30% of calories from protein, and what it showed is that risk of disease increased when that protein came from animal products, but when the protein came from plant products, it didn't increase risk of disease at all. And so we have so many studies that have compared plant and animal protein and risk of death and disease. And all of these studies are really consistent in terms of risk. And so I think it's, case closed, in my opinion. And I feel really badly for the people that are hooked into that way of eating. It's really a tragedy. It's a tragedy for them, for the animals, for the planet. And I just really hope it stops being such a popular way to go. That's really, really sad.
Yeah. I think people like Dr. McDougall says, they love to hear good news about their bad habits.
Yeah, exactly.
and so then they see somebody like Dr. Sean Baker or Ken Berry or whoever the next new, Saladino, whatever.
Yes.
They see these people and they, oh, wow, that's all I need right there is this one person. If they actually look at the overwhelming evidence, even the Institute of Medicine's the acceptable distribution of macronutrients, totally carbohydrate heavy.
Yeah, it's the AMDR, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range.
And they say at the same time they're saying less saturated fat, more fiber,
Yes, absolutely.
And if you look at, we're such a small percentage of the population, but yet we got Ornish and Nutrition Facts, PCRM, we got all this stuff in our favor, even Academy of
Nutrition and Dietetics. Yeah, they're not looking at the World Health Organization or the FAO or the Eat Lancet reports or any of these really where they've gathered scientists from however 30 or 40 countries around the world to come together to determine what diet is really best for health, for example. There are many of these papers now. They all come to the same conclusion, all of them. We need to be shifting towards a plant-based diet. In Canada, we have our food guide and our dietary guidelines. In the States, we've got the Institute of Medicine with food guides and dietary guidelines, really pointing towards more plant. In Canada, it's very strongly towards plant-based diets. In the States, a little less so, but still moving in that direction slowly. We have the Eat Lancet Commission that had scientists from all over the world come together to try to come up with recommendations for the diet that would best sustain the human population in terms of health and the environment and all of those things. Their conclusion was we need to eat more plants and fewer animal products and fewer processed foods. The World Health Organization says the same. The FAO, the UNU, their big report, again, the same, on sustainable diets, same story, more plants, fewer animals. And it's just consistent. If you look at, that FAO UNU report, they actually highlighted the countries that are really promoting plant-based diets, and they have quotes for, Brazil and Qatar and the UK and Germany, and where they all have, plant-based in their recommendations and are really more progressive in that direction. And so they were commending all of these countries that were moving forward in that way. And so we see this over and over again. It's really quite consistent. And I don't think there's much of a debate within, the progressive medical scientific world.
Is there anything out there at all saying eat more animals?
So is there anything out there that's saying eat more animals? I would say the only thing I can think of is in developing countries where people are very undernourished, where there is one dietary staple like rice, and they're encouraging their population to eat more animal products to get nutrient levels up.
Because of a total dearth in accessibility.
Yeah, exactly.
The food desert.
Yeah, the food desert. Other than that, I really don't know of any that are credible, public health authorities that would be saying we should be eating more animals. I think that we're past that stage at this point in time.
Fasting, I think everybody believes that intermittent fasting is probably pretty dang beneficial. And you mentioned snacking being good, at least for kids. If you're just doing it in between meals and not after you should be done eating, it's probably not a big deal, right?
Yeah, and I don't snack myself, and I think that there are some people that it makes sense for and some people that it doesn't. So people that are overweight or obese, they don't need a snack. People that are elite athletes that are burning 5,000 calories a day, they need to snack to be able to meet those nutritional requirements. Children, because they have very small stomachs, may not be able to meet their energy needs, especially on a whole food plant-based diet with just 3 meals, because they get full so quickly. So a nutritious snack would make good sense for them. For myself, I find that, the way that I like to eat is I have my breakfast at, 8 in the morning, my lunch between 12 and 1 or something, my dinner around 5. I try to eat my dinner quite early, and I'm done eating by 5:30 or 6 at the latest. And then I don't eat until, 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning. So I have that kind of 14 to 16 hours quite often, or almost daily, there as a sort of a time-restricted feeding, if you will, or some people call it intermittent fasting, but it's really a time-restricted feeding. And so I find myself, I feel best doing that. And everybody's a little different. So I have friends who have problems with hypoglycemia, and they find that if they eat more small meals, they do better. But I think for most people, fewer meals is an easier way to control caloric intake. I just think it's easier that way. We tend to overeat less when we're eating fewer times a day and we don't eat between meals. We don't need to. If you eat a decent meal, it should absolutely keep you for 5 or 6 hours. You should not need to have, snacks in between.
Somebody I know who's vegan, she was having some digestive issues, some bloating, some, just cramps, whatever. I noticed she was eating late and all kinds of different hours, and it was mostly because of her job, she has this crazy work schedule and all that. But I kept saying, man, I wonder if you fasted, if it would help. And then stomach problems were all so bad that she decided she was gonna go to the doctor, and the doctor wanted to do this, that, and the other. Next thing you know, they were wanting to do a colonoscopy or whatever. And so they made her fast for the colonoscopy. She started feeling better because of the fast. It really helped her. And when they did the colonoscopy, she was perfect. There was nothing there. And I'm that was, I knew you didn't need to be doing that. And you know what's crazy is the doctor prescribed her fiber. And I'm she's vegan, that's all she eats is whole foods, 90% of the, I'm you're gonna, and I'm telling the doctors, I'm what are you doing? Why are you gonna prescribe her fiber when she's, you know what I mean?
When she eats 70 grams of fiber a day or whatever.
Yeah. I've heard somebody say, oh, I know vegans who've been vegan for 10 years started having problems. Could it be that they're just not disciplined eating times? Could maybe an intermittent fasting schedule really resolve all that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And just because a person is vegan doesn't mean their diet is healthy, doesn't mean it's balanced, doesn't mean it's, well designed for their body. We need to really look at how often we're eating, what we're eating, how close to bedtime we're eating. The time you eat matters. If you eat a meal, and then go to bed an hour later, it's not good for your sleep. It's not good for your digestive system. So we need to look at those fine details of eating to make sure we get things balanced out. And I think it was, that's such a good point, that people can have problems with digestion and all of that because of when they're eating and what they're eating when. And it seems for a lot of people, if they're eating late at night, it's not always the healthiest choices late at night. It seems late at night you're more likely to eat the salty snack foods or the crispy foods or whatever it is. And so I think we just need to be really conscious of that and try, if you have those kinds of issues, try playing around, because in some cases it could be a sensitivity to something. So you might be sensitive to whatever, gluten or whatever the case may be. And when you modify your diet a little bit, the symptoms go away. All vegan diets are not equal. All vegan diets will not support your digestion in the same way. So it does take a little bit of personalization of the diet so that it works for you.
As far as people failing, what do you find to be the most common reasons people fail? Is it what we just talked about, and is there anything else?
There are two scenarios I see quite often. Number one is people that are really into the animals, the environment, and they just switch from meat and potatoes to pasta and bagels. They don't pay attention to eating healthfully, and they eat a lot of fast vegan food or fast food vegan food. They might be having, a vegan donut at breakfast. They might be having, vegan whatever burrito at lunch, and just eating a lot of highly processed foods. Or they're, predominantly refined carbohydrates, which we're familiar with, we're comfortable with. So people can easily switch from meat and potatoes to the pasta and tomato sauce and the bagels and vegan cream cheese or whatever. To switch from a meat and potato diet to a highly processed or refined vegan diet, it doesn't do you any favors in terms of disease risk reduction and so forth. It's just a mistake. You want to switch from meat and potatoes to vegetables and beans more than, these refined foods. And the second mistake I see people make getting overly restrictive, and I've actually seen a number of people where they become underweight. They absolutely eat almost no fat at all. They won't eat nuts and seeds. They won't eat, there's just so many things they won't eat because they might not be healthy, and they don't believe in any sort of supplements, so they get B12 deficient, or they even in some cases get low in protein. I know a lot of people think you can't be protein deficient on a vegan diet. Trust me, you can. You may not have, a kwashiorkor, but you can not, have enough protein to retain your muscle mass well, or to even build your skin tissue well. And so your skin becomes thin, your hair starts to fall out. I've seen this often. And so we need to be, I think, sort of balanced in our approach and not overly restrictive, to include a variety, to include sufficient calories, and not to be afraid of any macronutrient, whether it's carbohydrate, fat, or protein, from whole plant foods. Whole plant foods are good bets regardless of the macronutrient profile, if they're whole foods. Failed vegans are some of the biggest anti-vegans out there, which is sad for me, because I really believe that pretty much anyone can do well on a vegan diet if they get the right kind of support. And so I think it's kind of sad that they leave so disgruntled without seeing a plant-based doctor, dietitian, and getting the kind of support they would need to figure out what's not working for them, because it can usually be corrected, and almost always. And so I just think it's really a shame.
How can people maybe find you, and how can they get that support?
Yeah, so I tend to not do a lot of one-on-one, although I'm always happy to answer a question or two. I tend not to do long consults just because I have so many projects I'm working on, research projects and courses. I'm working on a course with ACLM, or the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, one with the Food Revolution Network. I always have a book project on the go. So I tend to have to limit my time with one-on-one, although I'm always happy to answer a question. But there are just hordes of plant-based dietitians out there that have all of the skills, and that's what they do. There are lots of coaches, there is a lot of support out there, and there are tons of fabulous resources on the internet. So there's nutritionfacts.org, there's veganhealth.org. Nutritionfacts.org is fun and upbeat, and there's a video on everything you can imagine. Veganhealth.org is the deep dive. So you want to know about almost anything. It is done accurately, thoroughly, and is very balanced. I love veganhealth.org. There are a lot of others that provide wonderful information. Many dietitians, many physicians who are doing a great job. And so there are a lot of resources on the internet. There are many books. Of course, it's one of the ways that I've tried to provide resources. So the last book that I released was a book called Nourish, that I wrote with a pediatrician from San Francisco by the name of Dr. Reshma Shah. And this book, Nourish, is actually a book to help families, pregnant women, families with infants and children who want to do plant-based well. And so we cover everything, all the nutrients, the stages of the life cycle, the whole works. And we even dig deeply into sort of all of the eating concerns with children, and the picky eaters, and the family table, and all of the things that you need to know to have really to raise healthy eaters. And so that was the last book. And before that, I did 2 books on diabetes, Kick Diabetes Essentials and Kick Diabetes Cookbook, with my writing partner Vasanto Molina. And actually, we just finished a book on plant protein, which should be out in the next few months. So I keep writing. This plant protein is the 13th book. These resources, becoming vegan, is, a lot of people say it's their vegan Bible that they you know, you can just kind of, it's something that you would flip to. You want to know about iron or iodine or whatever. You just, you know, search that and you'll find a whole section that will help you to navigate any of the concerns. And it goes through the entire life cycle, and it, you know, it just covers everything: underweight, overweight, eating disorders, the whole 9 yards. And so those are the kinds of books I've tried to provide as reference books. I just had a professor from Taiwan translate the Becoming Vegan, and is now their nutrition text for their course on plant-based nutrition. Oh, fantastic.
And this is your book that you left.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Okay. Thanks, Wanda. You know, the last book was on plant protein, and Vasanto, my writing partner, and I, who've been writing together for 25 years or more, the next book we want to write is for seniors, a plant-based book for seniors. And Vasanto is now 80 years old, so she's still working, you know, full time, which is pretty amazing. And actually, I have to say something else about Vasanto, because in 2016, she actually won the highest award offered by Dietitians of Canada, called the Riley Jeffs Memorial Lecture Award. And it's just really the biggest honor that any dietitian in our country can receive. We're being recognized in that way, which is really very, very wonderful. It's encouraging for young dietitians who are, you know, plant-based and enthusiastic, and go through, you know, school being a little discouraged that there's still so much, you know, animal food presence in the programs. There's hope, definitely there's hope, and they're changing things. They're educating their professors, so it's really important.
Where can somebody go to find like a showcase of your books?
I have a website, brendadavisrd.com. I have other websites for the various books, like Becoming Vegan website and Kick Diabetes website, but brendadavisrd.com. I am really bad at keeping up with that website. I wish I had someone helping me, because I don't navigate it very well, so it's not always up to date, but certainly the books are there. I want to say thanks to the NHA. This is the National Health Association Conference. They put on this conference once a year, and I think this year they had about 300 or so, somewhere in that neighborhood, participants, and it was amazing. So if you're looking for a conference to go to next year, think about the NHA conference. It's reasonable and it's a lot of fun. Healthscience.org. They have a wonderful publication, so that's, yeah, something to check out.
You say you only take 1 or 2 questions from people generally.
Yeah.
But here I am, honored. I just can't believe how much time you gave me, and that was so sweet. I appreciate it so much.
Oh, well, thank you for asking me, and it was really a lot of fun, and I'm excited about what you're doing. You're educating the world.